Welcome to IT in Motion, where we make autonomous IT entertaining and informative. My name is Sun.
And I'm Josh. We're your hosts. Today we're talking to Karen Pugliese, a channel executive. Everyone give it up for Karen.
Welcome to the show, Karen.
Thank you so much for that very enthusiastic round of applause. It's much appreciated.
Well, it's your adoring fans, Karen. They're here to support you and help you through this.
We got all types of buttons and sounds for you here. So, Karen, why don't you share with our guests a little bit about yourself? Brief description.
Sure. So I've been a channel sales executive and probably for about the last 15 or so years. I've spent a lot of time in a bunch of kind of different industries, primarily tech and security. Spent about 10 years in GE doing a whole bunch of different stuff. And I'm based in Toronto, Canada, where it's kind of feeling like Dallas today. It's pretty hot and sticky. So thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited.
Well, thanks for coming on. We'd like to get started here with some games. So the premise of this game is we'll give you sort of a description, an analogy of a term from golfing because you're a big golf fan.
I am.
And then the idea is you'll try to figure out what that term is that we're trying to describe.
All right. Excellent.
So
we'll
we'll start with the first one, on crutches or in a wheelchair. What could that mean?
I'm going to go with handicap, which there we go, an area of focus for me right now as I try to lower my handicap.
What's your handicap right now?
It's sitting at about 23, and
okay.
So I'm trying to get it sub 20s.
That's tough. That's a big accomplishment.
We'll see how that goes. It requires practice, which is I prefer to play. So there's right there. Then it can give you an idea of how things are going.
All right. Second question is a hot beverage popular in England, and it's also a letter in the alphabet.
That would be tea, probably TEA versus TEE, but we'll go with tea.
That's right.
All right, an underground fortress.
An underground fortress. That would be a bunker, sand bunker that I get to spend lots of time in, usually more than one shot.
All right,
get out.
All right, what is the United States' national bird?
That would be an American eagle.
And what's an eagle in golf for those who don't know?
So an eagle in golf is 2 strokes less than par.
Right. So if you're supposed to be able to get it in 5, if you're considered a good golfer,
you give me 3.
You get it in 3.
You'd have to get it in 3. Yeah, I've never had an eagle.
Yeah, it's pretty rare. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
All right.
Hence the 23 handicap.
The 23 handicap.
And then a syringe going into a Dorito.
So syringes make me think of COVID. So I know COVID has absolutely nothing to do with golf. So I'm going to say a chip shot.
Correct.
That's right.
All right. You got it all.
Excellent.
Well done. We would love to actually get to know you a little bit more about some of the interests that you have. We know that you're very passionate about DEI, some of the initiatives there. Can you tell us about what they are and your experience with them, why it's important to you?
Yeah, so I think it really stems from kind of 2 things. I think first is that the majority of my career has been in male-dominated industries. So the security industry, very male-dominated, tech, very male-dominated. But I think the driver was really the start of my career when I was at GE. So for those of you who don't know, GE had a women's network kind of like in the late 90s. So, way before their time, way before I think DEI was even something that they talked about. And so when you combine that with the idea that as a business, Jack Welch was really kind of focused on this concept of moving people around, right? If you were a high performer, high potential, you'd go from like appliances to healthcare to lighting. And so, but you might not like literally know anything technical about those about those products, but you had this diversity of experience, right? Diversity of perspective. And it was so ingrained and woven into the fabric within the organization that I think for me, as I was kind of growing up in my career, that became such a critical aspect to building great teams and really building great organizations. So, I mean, there's so much that's been written and studied on this today, right? I think there's something that comes out almost every month talking about how more diverse teams result in, better outcomes, better culture, greater profitability, greater revenue growth. I think, gender equity or equality within the workplace. If you're a marketing organization, especially if you're in the consumer world, but even if you're in the B2B world, if your customer is a woman and you're focused on, a whole bunch of men creating that marketing strategy, then you are potentially not resonating with 50% of the population. And so I think that there's more than enough studies to support the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion within organizations. It's really about how do you action that and how do you create that as part of the fabric.
I love that. I mean, just even thinking about it, getting a global view, or really like the bird's eye view of an organization and how these different parts work together, is going to help you be a better team member. And really, the team is a diverse set of people that are good at different things that are complementary. And so that experience, the fact that they had that foresight into the value of that GE back then, I think is it was before its time in certain ways.
Yeah. Oh, I would 100% agree. I think that they realized that it had more to do about the values and the approach and perspective of the person versus that technical knowledge. And there was like I don't know, I'll call it like a tagline that people would talk about, which was like, you can't teach self-motivation, you can't teach culture and values. You can teach all of the other stuff, right? You can teach somebody how an MRI works. You can teach somebody how a light bulb works, but you can't teach those values and that ability to be self-motivated and curious, right? Which I think, that's really kind of what it drives, this curiosity.
Love that.
Curiosity is definitely an important attribute in high performers. Going back to the DEI question a little bit, what are some of the best practices of DEI? What is a good way for a company to introduce DEI into their culture?
Yeah, so I think the first piece is to really understand kind of what do you want to achieve, right? So I think that, there's a lot of organizations who say, hey, we're going to have a DEI program, and they post it on their external site, their internal site. They probably have a great brochure. It's probably in their annual report, but there's really not a lot of substance to it. And so I think the first thing is to really understand what do they want to achieve, and then put some metrics around it. And so I think that's kind of the key. Otherwise, you never really know whether you're making impact or not. And so it needs to be measurable, whatever the target is. I think it's less about what the target is, like what the number is, versus having a target to get to. So I think that's the first piece. I think the next piece is that it really has to be kind of at the employee level. So there needs to be, it needs to be programmatic. So yes, you can have a sponsorship approach, you can have a mentorship approach, but you really need to understand kind of what the employees are facing and what you're trying to really work on. So if it's unconscious bias, if that's kind of what you're going to focus on, then you really need to kind of drill that down to, do we look at job descriptions? Do we look at job postings? Do we look at creating, specific employee support groups that are really focused around that? Do we leverage an external organization to help us with training, to help us with, facilitating conversations? But it has to be woven into the fabric of what you do every day as part of your job, and not, like there's some organizations where you join the DEI team. Well, if you've got you've got 1,000 employees and you've only got 10 people on the DEI team, I got to tell you, like, it's probably not a lot of value in having that DEI initiative. And so it really needs to be throughout your organization. And that's why it really does need executive sponsorship, right? You need either the CEO or somebody within the executive ranks to really own it, talk about it, walk it all day, every day. And so, you know, who that person is, I mean, it's great if it's the CEO. It's not always the CEO. It's probably less effective when it's the head of HR. Not that it isn't effective when it's the chief diversity officer, but you still need that alignment within the rest of the C-level. You can't, again, going back to that example, you can't have the chief diversity officer kind of having their diversity team, and yet the rest of the organization is not actively engaged in
needs to be interwoven.
Uncovering those needs. Yeah, it needs to be interwoven throughout the organization at all the levels, right? And so, you know, maybe unconscious bias is what you're focusing on kind of with your directors and your managers, but maybe, you know, with your sellers, I'll just say sellers in the field, like maybe that's more so around, you know, looking for the opportunity to hear diverse voices, right? When you're talking about, you know, winning a deal or going out to a customer or creating a brand or creating a strategy. So you really have to look at it a bunch of different ways. It's not like, here's the pie, just go ahead and eat it. It's really like, okay, we need to make the pie from scratch. And so you're starting like with flour.
Right. It's sort of like what, you talk about in the security industry, right? Where you don't just buy security. Security is something that happens. And so what I'm really hearing you say is you need someone up at that top level who cares, because they set the tone for the organization, hopefully more than one person who cares. And then you need to work on change throughout the organization, right? And building up the bench, the ranks of people who can fill those roles over time, because people need to come up in the organization to be able to have that sort of influence over the culture. So Karen, you talked about a number of changes happening inside of organizations for DEI, but of course you've also talked to us about some other changes that are happening in the industry. Could you tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that, post-COVID, that there's really some interesting, I'm going to say some interesting outcomes. Really, I know COVID wasn't a good thing, right? I'm by no means am I saying that it was positive, but I think what it did uncover is that, you know, people can be very productive remotely, right? And people are able to build relationships and engagement without necessarily sitting in the same office beside an individual, right? And they can drive creativity virtually. And so I think it really uncovered two things. And we see kind of this trend happening in the market. I think the first piece is really around where innovation is happening. So where startups are kind of being born or really kind of getting into that funding stage. And, you know, before it was really in some very specific markets, right? So in the US, it was very much Silicon Valley. You would see it kind of in New York. You'd see it in Ashburn as an example because of all the data center space that's there and all the players that are there. But I think now you've got incubators kind of happening all over the world, right? From a U.S. standpoint, you've seen Dallas kind of really kind of pick up. You've seen places in Florida, which, you know, before really weren't considered, you know, the place to start up your tech business. Right. So that's really kind of taken a little bit of a different approach. And then at the same time, what you've seen is that you've seen some of these innovation hubs or startup hubs kind of being co-located with universities, right? And so there was a little bit of that before, but really not kind of what we're seeing now. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we've gotten very used to this whole concept of a distributed workforce, right? This remote workforce. So I think that that's one of the big drivers. I think the other driver is that the B2B space has kind of had a bunch of B2C blend into it. And so what used to be, you know, I'll talk from a channel perspective, when you used to build a partner strategy, you were really looking at how do you build a partner strategy for that organization or for that sales organization or potentially for the owner of the organization. Now you need to kind of build programs and strategies throughout the organization. So not just the salesperson, but now you're looking at the person who's, the inside salesperson, the person who's maybe doing estimating, the person who's doing bidding, the person who's doing solution design, the, technical resources that are out in the field. And, for something that used to be very much B2B and, how do I give the rebate to the partner? Now you're looking at how do you incent all of those people kind of in that journey and not just the organization, as an example. So I think those are two of the big shifts that that I think we're seeing and that we'll continue to see. Everybody used to spend tons of money on MDF, right? Like marketing development funds.
Sure. Right.
So when you didn't have an event to go to, what did you do with that money? Right? You did some really creative things that nobody ever would have thought of before. So I think a lot of those things are going to stick, and I think that they're really influencing kind of what the go-forward approach is.
Yeah, well, that first part you were talking about I'd call it the atomization of the workforce, this idea that the workforce is a lot more distributed and investments are happening in different areas. It reminds me a little bit of the development of electricity. And when electricity came out, people knew it was going to be transformative, but they went and put it into factories and you wouldn't see productivity increases in those factories. Right. It wasn't until they readjusted the factories, redesigned them with the idea of electricity being in mind, electricity being put into products and into homes, that you really started to see these giant gains in productivity from the new technology. And in some sense, we've been seeing that with the information revolution, right? We've had these incredible network technologies, computing technologies develop, and we've seen growth in some areas, right? Like entertainment. But this sort of atomization, these remote first companies, these hybrid companies really seem like they may have the potential to be the thing that changes how we, rather than configure factories, configure our companies to unleash new levels of productivity and new types of productivity.
Agreed. And I think that kind of what got lost over the course of, whatever you want to call it, a year to 3 years, depending on where you were in the world and where you were in the lockdown kind of distribution graph. A lot of organizations hired people, right, during the course of those 3 years. And so now all of a sudden, when there's this talk about going back to the office, and I had a conversation with somebody last week about this, was, they were asked to go back into the office 3 days a week. And so they were like, yeah, sure, I'm okay. It'd be great to see everybody. But then when they got back into the office, they realized that the majority of the people that they work with do not live in the same city as them.
Right.
They live they're all over the Americas. And so, they went to the office and they said, I kind of sat by myself. And that was lonelier than sitting kind of at home in my office, doing my remote work. And so I think that there's this shift that I feel like we're kind of in the middle of it, where everybody's just trying to find their way through it, which is, are we going to build remote teams? And if we are, then how do we leverage the real estate, the space that we have, to be beneficial, right, to provide a return on investment? And if we're not going to be a remote first organization, then what do we do with all of this great talent that we've acquired that doesn't exist in the geography that we're in? And I think that technology is going to be the thing that really kind of helps bridge that gap. But I think that for a lot of organizations who have a lot of real estate, this is a really tough time for them, because it's a balance between keeping this great talent that they've acquired, but making sure that they're optimizing the space and the expense that they have. And so those are kind of tough. Those are tough kind of conversations and decisions.
Yeah, and I've found that actually working from home is actually more productive in like getting things done. However, the value of working with other people in an office is when you're doing things like planning, or you have to collaborate and really be creative about putting together a solution, making sure that there's alignment on that. That kind of experience with other people can be very valuable. Being
Agreed.
there physically in the same room with folks. Even the idea of just using a simple whiteboard is actually a
Yeah.
little bit more challenging virtually at times than doing it physically. Now, just in addition to that, obviously we talked about productivity going up significantly through this period of time. And through that, I think a lot of people felt a little bit of burnout. And there's been terms like quiet quitting being thrown out there. Can you
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about how employees can continue to retain and encourage retaining these valuable employees that they have now that, these things are starting to come up?
Yeah, I think I think it's a shared responsibility. So that's kind of the first thing I would say. Um, I've always been a real big proponent of the idea that, there's a bunch of things that you as an individual are interested in, right?
Yeah.
That are motivating. So, I'll speak to me. I had a conversation with an individual, a gentleman earlier today, and I said the same thing to him, which is, you're not going to find a role that kind of fulfills all of your interests. So you kind of have to start by saying, like, does 70% of what I do, is that 70% good, right? And then what is the 30% where I feel that I'm kind of missing out? So, like, for me, I like doing fundraising. I like, figuring out. We do, historically, we've done a lawn bowling fundraising within our community, and then that money goes back to the school, usually to buy tech, which, so
Yeah.
tech person,
Sure.
fundraising for tech. But I liked doing that. Now, there's no fundraising happening in the tech world. Like, I'm not fundraising to fund like new software being written within the organization. So I looked for opportunities to kind of fulfill that other 30%. So I think as an individual, you need to kind of say, okay, if I love the 70% of what I'm doing, then what are the other 30% of things that I'm interested in? And can I get that by being part of an association or part of a board or a not-for-profit, or maybe, maybe an innovation hub, right? So, maybe that's mentoring somebody. Or can I look for that opportunity within our organization? Right? So if I'm interested in software, can I go to the engineering software folks and spend some time with them and say, hey, what can I help you with? Right? Can I take can I take my political science and economics background and somehow provide some value as it pertains to that? So I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is really from an organizational perspective, is to look for what I call stretch opportunities, right? Opportunities to get people kind of out of their comfort zone. And I had a great leader that I worked with several years ago. We were having some challenges in a manufacturing facility, and he was like, hey, Karen, why don't you go down there? And I was like, I don't really know anything about manufacturing. He's like, no, you don't, but you know what? You're a great process person. You understand the pain that the sales team and the customers are facing. And so you've got a perspective that they probably don't have. And it was, I think, a great experience on both sides. I think it was a great experience for the folks in the manufacturing facility to understand that the way that they were looking at solving the problem was actually creating more pain for our customers and our sellers. And it was a great opportunity for me to understand that they had process issues, because we as a sales organization didn't do a really good job of explaining to them what did we need them to actually accomplish. Not like make more, but make more of these specific ones and then these specific ones, and kind of how to move that through it. So I think that's the ownership on the side of the organization, which is to really understand from an employee, okay, what are you interested in? Whether that's career path or just hobby or interest. And then look for those, right? And try and uncover those and create the opportunity to do that. I mean, I think one of the greatest, I can talk about all the great things at GE because I loved Jack Welch. One of the great things about GE was that, at least in my career, is that I spent time in audit. I spent time in mergers and acquisitions. I spent time in the warehouse. I spent time in IT. I spent time in finance. And so when you do that, either in the same business or in multiple businesses, you really get a good understanding of how an organization works. But you also get a really good understanding of the things that you're interested in and not interested in.
Right.
And so like I knew like audit was not going to be like that was not my career path. But it was an eye opener to actually spend some time working with that team.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that development of a shared understanding is so important for businesses to be successful. There've been kind of tagging back to something you said earlier. You're talking about some changes that have kind of come up in channel sales. I'd like to explore that a little bit more. Like, what else has changed in channel sales in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the idea of kind of looking at all of the individuals kind of within within a partner organization and the role that they play. I think that's been really big. I think that the tiering versus segmentation has also been a big change. So, if you look back probably 5-6 years ago, most people had like a platinum, gold, silver, bronze tier kind of within their tiering or partner program. I think one of the great things that's really come with the abundance of data that everybody has today, and and the building of AI kind of into data sets and partner portals and data universes, if you want to call them that, is the ability to really start getting into segmentation, not so much around revenue, but around what makes up that partner, right? And so there's a lot of talk around the intricacies of what that looks like. So, I'll give you a couple of examples, right? Are they a great partner, but they're 100% committed to just one product set, right? They just want to be experts in that product set. Are they looking at being experts in that product set in a specific geography? Mm-hmm. So do they just want to do like the Northeast, right? That's going to be kind of like, that's going to be their geography that they're going to focus on, and they want to dominate that market. Or are they looking at being great and they want to be great within the Americas or globally, right? Those are all different segmentations with all different requirements. I think historically what we would look at from a channel perspective is we would say, okay, they want to be great in that one product, and so we're going to treat them the same as somebody else who wants to be great in that one product, but globally. And the reality is that that's really not the same go-to-market strategy. That's not the same level of support that they need. One is going to need multi-language, the other one is not. One's going to need to create breadth and brand across the globe. The other one is really looking at a specific geography. And so I think the segmentation piece has really kind of changed how organizations are looking at their partner network and really kind of moving away from this idea of tiering, right? So, I think the greatest example is you could have a partner, 80% of what they do is with you. But maybe they're not at the top tier because they don't have that revenue. Are they a more valuable partner or a less valuable partner? Historically, we just look at revenue and say, well, they're less valuable because they don't do as much as that top partner. But that top partner, maybe they only give you 5% of their business, right? And so the segmentation has really kind of changed how we're treating partners and how we're incenting them and how we're supporting them. I think the other piece is that there used to be this whole idea that all you wanted to do was acquire partners, right? So like, how do I grow my partner program, which was usually around adding more partners into the program. And I had a partner share with me once, he said, the first 6 months of our relationship was fabulous. He's like, you guys called me all the time. You came and saw me. You did training. You took me out for lunch. You invited me to events. He's like, once I got all my training done, once I got myself set up in the portal, he's like, I didn't hear from you. It's like you got me to the altar, we got married, and then you left.
Oh.
And so, it really kind of highlighted the fact that we spend so much time onboarding the partner, and then we feel like we've taught them to fish and we don't need to spend time with them anymore. And I think that a lot of organizations from a channel perspective are really looking at, okay, how do I create that onboarding journey? But once they're onboarded, and they've got all the tools, what does the next 6 months look like? Because you kind of see there's this like acquisition, so we've acquired this many, and then there's this huge rapid drop off once they've kind of gotten into the portal and gotten trained. And so I think that that's the second piece of it. We used to just kind of think, well, they're going to figure it out. But let's be realistic. Most organizations, whether they're direct sales or channel sales, have less sellers today than they did before. Mm-hmm. Part of it is because we're distributed. We've got more inside sales people. We've got more sales associates. We've got, different ways of kind of connecting with the market. And so if you're going to do that, then you need to use technology and tools to try and figure out how to onboard and keep those partners and really reduce that constant churn, because you're spending time and money every single time you're trying to onboard somebody. You've got to find them. You've got to, figure out how to help them get trained, help them get up to speed. And so I think those are the kind of like three things I would say are big shifts in the channel space. And some of them I think accelerated as a result of COVID, and others that I think were just like natural.
That was going to be our next question, is like how much was impacted through COVID, right? That change in structure.
Yeah. I think the B2B, B2C shift very much impacted by COVID, right? I think that when you're sitting at home and you've got an organization trying to endear you to their solution, to their product, you're kind of a little bit more about like, what's in it for me? Like, how are you going to help me? I'm now an island unto myself. Right. I'm not sitting in the office. Like, there's no Friday donuts or, Friday ice cream truck to make me feel great about it. So it's become a little bit of a B2C type of scenario. So I 100% think that was accelerated or influenced by COVID.
Mainly the quarantining aspect. It's people just being
kind of separated off,
stuck inside of their houses.
Yeah, 100%. Because you didn't have that scenario where, a vendor came in and did like a food truck and a lunch and learn, like all of that kind of went away. And so it was really like, how are you going to help me do my job when I'm, sitting in my basement, trying to design this solution with your product. And, I don't have my bookshelf with, my 400 books that you've maybe given me over the course of the past, 20 years.
But you now have ChatGPT.
But now you've got ChatGPT.
It can make up answers that may or may not be correct.
That's true.
That may or may not be accurate. That's right.
You do have to vet it.
Yeah.
So you spent a lot of time helping companies transform, reinvigorate. What are some tips our listeners and viewers can take away if they want to do the same thing?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is to really, and again, I'm gonna kind of coin a GE thing, right? It was like, you're number one or you're number two. And I'm not saying that if you're not going to be number one or number two, you should just give up on your business and just walk away. But what I am saying is that if you take that mindset, right? If you take that mindset of what do we need to do in order to be number one or number two, you start getting rid of the noise pretty quickly, right? You start like, that lunch and learn session on Thursday is not going to get you to number one or number two. Right? That, that branding campaign or that, co-branded document that you're going to load up on your partner portal is not going to get you to number one or number two. So it really, I think, forces you to think a little bit more strategically and get rid of some of that noisy stuff that's happening kind of in your everyday life, in your everyday strategy. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing that we don't do enough, and I'm equally guilty, is to look at other industries that are not, and I don't mean competitors, right? So don't just go do what your competitor's doing, but look at adjacent industries that have some of the same characteristics or criteria, right? So, if if you're not in a mature industry, look at some things that mature industries are doing. Either, so if you're channel driven, around distribution, around partner attainment or partner growth. If you're kind of a direct sales model, look at more mature organizations and how they're leveraging AI, right? How are they leveraging AI to understand forecasting, to understand, goods production, to understand funnel, right? What's your win ratio? How many deals do you have to win in order to potentially hit your number? So I think that a lot of the time, the benchmarking and the things that we do, we look very internally. And so I think if you want to be a catalyst or a change maker, one is that you have to think really big. And so you kind of have to forget that kind of day-to-day activity or month-to-month activity that you would otherwise be looking for, and really think, if I needed to go from number 5 in the market to number 1 in the market, what are the things that I would need to do? And then you can really start focusing on that. Those are going to be big incremental changes. And go and steal ideas from others. I mean, I think it's the best compliment, right? You take somebody else's idea, you copy paste special it, you tweak it for your business. I think that's great. And then I think the third piece is to have really diverse voices and diverse experiences around the table. You can't see the forest for the trees. And I think one of the great things with being in an organization for a long time is that you really do learn the organization. I think one of the detractors from it is that you don't see that forest. You don't see those trees anymore, right? It's just one big forest. And so you need somebody from the outside, somebody with a different viewpoint, to really look at the opportunity and see it a little bit differently. And it doesn't mean somebody said, oh, well, that's going to, it's going to cost a bunch more money. No. You're going to take the money that you're using on all those noisy things that are really not giving you, big revolutionary growth or big revolutionary change. And you're just going to spend it differently.
Yeah, makes sense.
I love that. Karen, it has been such a pleasure to have you on this episode today. Some of our guests, I'm sure, would love to learn a little bit more about you and maybe your contact info. How can they learn?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm a pretty avid poster on LinkedIn. So just look up Karen Pugliese, and you can connect with me. Otherwise, feel free to search me up and just use the Google. There aren't that many of us out there, at least in Toronto. I can't speak for Italy, but I can tell you, in Toronto, I'm pretty easy to find.
Excellent. Well,
Thank
folks,
you again.
I hope you have all learned a ton from this. I know I certainly have, and Josh probably has as well. Everybody,
Absolutely.
please, one more time for Karen. Thank you again, Karen.
Thank you. Right back at you. Right back at you.
conversation.
You guys were great. Thank you so much for today. Just
Thank you.
tons and tons of fun.
And we appreciate everyone listening in, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care, everyone.
Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, hit the subscribe button. We're available on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and many other podcast platforms. We release new episodes on a regular basis, and we're also available at ScienceLogic.com/podcast.